Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk more about presidential health. This is the third part in this that I've discussed on the American presidency. You know, it's an interesting thing when you think about it. We've had 43 individuals at the time of this recording who have been president. We're having an election right now in 2016, which falls into the category of bizarre. But also, the thing is that there has not been a president in office who has not had to deal with extremely emotional, extremely stressful situations. And we forget the fact quite often that presidents are very much like everybody else. They're human. And therefore, they're all put into situations in which can put their psyche into a bad state of order. And in many cases, we have had individuals who have totally lost it. Now, let's go back to the very beginning. I mean, with the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, we had presidents of sort, but we're not going to deal with those right now. We're going to deal with the presidents under the Constitution, which our government, which more or less started in 1789. George Washington was our first president, more or less appointed. It was unanimous. Washington loved to be adored. He was a dandy. I mean, he loved to be in the center, and he had a hard time if you didn't love him. And, you know, he ran for president. Of course, he was appointed, and of course, he was quite happy to do it, even though he said, "I will accept the position reluctantly." Translation, hot damn, I'm happy to do this. But the thing is that George Washington reached a point in his second term where he discovered he wasn't being loved. He was being burned in effigy outside of the presidential home in Philadelphia. He didn't know how to handle that. That was pretty rough on him. And emotionally, he had a really hard time with it. And he was ever so happy to leave the presidency. A very tired, very sick man. But he had to deal with many crises. And he had the major crisis of all, if you think about it. What do I do? Since everything that I do will be watched by history. That's a pretty stressful situation. His successor, John Adams, who was a very emotional person to begin with, he really kind of, in many respects, lost it during his presidency. He went crazy at times. But I have to tell you something, that John Adams faced something that most presidents have not: the total annihilation of your country. Now I'll explain that, because we don't talk about this very often. We had what we call a faux war, fake war, an undeclared war with France. In many respects, it was sea battles. But we had people like Alexander Hamilton, who, while brilliant, was often a cup and saucer short of a full plate setting. And he wanted to go to war in the worst way. And, well, he had George Washington become the general-in-chief. This was in 1798 into 99. Washington was not well. And Hamilton had developed a relationship with Washington to such a degree he would more or less be almost a puppeteer with Washington. And the thing is that he had Washington become the general-in-chief, and of course under Washington would be Hamilton. The idea was, of course, that as soon as Washington retires or leaves, the general in charge will be Hamilton. Well, Adams, of course, told Hamilton, you want to fight a war with what? What army? What navy? It was France that helped us win the American Revolution. Who's going to come to their aid now? And so what Adams had to do was to be constantly attacked every day, not just by Hamilton, but by his cabinet that was controlled by Hamilton. He had become the puppeteer of Adams' cabinet. You see, Adams, in honoring Washington, kept Washington's cabinet. Great mistake. Because what Adams needed was a cabinet that was faithful to Adams. He also had a vice president. You have to understand, the laws changed. The Constitution would change shortly after this, but the way it originally worked with the presidency, whoever won the presidency would become, of course, president. But the next runner-up would be vice president. Now, when Washington was appointed president, the vice president, was John Adams. They were both Federalists. It worked fine. But then when Adams ran, he defeated Thomas Jefferson. And therefore Jefferson became his vice president, and he became a hostile vice president. Jefferson did everything in his power to undermine the presidency of John Adams. So Adams was being attacked on every level, in every direction. Psychologically, probably one of the roughest presidencies that ever existed. And he stuck to his guns. And he worked out a peace program. Finally did. With the XYZ affair, all of a sudden Adams was popular for a while. But that didn't last. And John Adams survived. And, you know, he was just destroyed by the politicians. He was destroyed by Jefferson. He was destroyed by everyone. And what is amazing is that Washington, of course, stayed away from everything. He didn't say much of anything, although one has to remember Washington was named the general-in-chief, and Washington announced he would be the general-in-chief. Adams didn't appoint him. It was a very ugly situation because he had Hamilton, and Hamilton was a snake in the grass, only matched by Thomas Jefferson. And these two snakes worked very hard to poison the presidency of John Adams, and they were successful. They destroyed his presidency. However, Adams saved the country. Upon leaving the White House, he announced it all and basically said it for what it was. I am leaving the cares of office for manure. He was going back to his farm. And to be perfectly honest, he went from one shithole to another. Except he was happier working with manure in his farm. We never give John Adams enough credit, to tell you the truth, because he did something really incredible. And I think that that's one of the great, great moments in the presidency. Right in the beginnings of the presidency, if you think about it. But he survived. But man, I can imagine privately that there were times when Adams must have just sat there and, you know, the man he considered his dearest friend, Thomas Jefferson, was vice president. And he was undermining him. It must have been a hard time. It took Adams a long, long time to forgive Thomas Jefferson. But that's another story for another time. Other presidents. Thomas Jefferson became president. He had Aaron Burr to drive him nuts, which was wonderful. He deserved it. I have not the warmest of feelings for Thomas Jefferson. And he went through his moments, but he was one who caused problems for people more than having problems caused for him. A lot of wonderful things about Thomas Jefferson, but one of them was not integrity. Very important. Another president that went through a crisis was the son of John Adams, John Quincy Adams. Brilliant man. Amazing man. But the thing is that John Quincy Adams became president. And it was ugly how he became president because there was a tie, more or less. Andrew Jackson got more of the popular vote. It was the first election in which popular vote was used. And the Electoral College was kind of split amongst several people. And Henry Clay, in this whole battle, announced that he would withdraw and throw his support from the Electoral College and from the House of Representatives toward Adams. Adams immediately made Henry Clay his Secretary of State, which caused a whole routine called the Unholy Bargain. And everyone who was opposing Adams announced at that point that they would not allow him to get any legislation through, that they would destroy his presidency. All those that were faithful to Andrew Jackson. And that they did. Those were 4 horrible years in the life of John Quincy Adams. And probably ones he did his best to try to forget. We have had other presidents. Now let's take a look at the one who really went through hell as well, Abraham Lincoln. You know, I've often wondered, by the time of the American Civil War, which is 1861, the United States had gone nuts. The United States had gone crazy. Now, if we look at the personalities and the mental health of our presidents, one that comes rather questionable sometimes is Abraham Lincoln. He had a lot of issues. But sometimes maybe when a country is so nuts, maybe you need someone who's not totally riding on a full deck to be in charge. Maybe they see things differently. I'm not saying that Lincoln was stupid. Lincoln was brilliant. Lincoln was an artist in many respects, a poet. From his pen, it was pure poetry. I mean, some of the most beautiful speeches ever. But was he totally sane? I don't think so. And did the Civil War affect him? Of course it did. Take a look at him in 1860 and then look at him in 1865. It's like almost 2 different people. He aged tremendously. He was only 56 years old when he dies. Look at those pictures. He looks like he's 70. And he was not too well-founded on a bedrock of sanity. He was married to Mary Todd Lincoln, who she was a cup and saucer short of a full play setting too. Brilliant as well, but kind of nutty. And so he lived in this world of kind of confusion, touch of insanity, mirth, chronic depression. I mean, people who knew him said he just oozed melancholy. People are always afraid he was going to kill himself. He always talked about death. But it was a man who, in today's understanding, was not at all sane, who could look at a country that was not at all sane and bring it back. It's pretty amazing if you think about it. but one can only imagine the pain of President Lincoln watching the tallies of the dead, getting letters every day stating that you should be dead, assassination threats constantly, having members of his own family on both sides, having his children. I mean, he had 4 children. His son died in the White House. His best friends were killed. His law student was killed. Even had dreams about dying. Talked about it being laid out in the East Room. A couple of weeks later, he was dead. Interesting individual. And you know something? The problem with Lincoln is that we'll never truly know Lincoln, because Lincoln was probably the most mysterious individual we've ever had as president. He didn't want you to know who he was. Very careful about that. And I think that his law partner, William Herndon, caught a lot of flack because when he wrote his books about Lincoln, he made Lincoln a little too human. And people weren't happy about that, because Lincoln, in our eyes today, is a statue. But Lincoln was an emotional, sometimes frightening individual who was incredibly brilliant, incredibly artistic, incredibly stressed. And he did amazing things. One of the presidents I really have to admire in that regard, but also question. What about others? As we go along here, I always do this right in my mind. I'm just sitting here talking. I like it this way. It's more like having a conversation. Although I can't have you talk to me directly. You can always ask questions and I'll be happy to write more stuff. But I love to have a group of people around and sit and chit-chat and talk about this stuff. Other people in the presidency, things you don't really think of, people you don't think of, that were really super emotional, went through an awful lot. William McKinley was a little emotional. Not too much. Theodore Roosevelt was not very emotional. You know, it's an interesting thing. I've already talked about Woodrow Wilson, who was, I think, probably one of the most dangerous people we ever had as president. Brilliant. He was a historian. Historians should never look and try to change stuff. They should talk about what was. And that was one of the problems. He lectured everybody. And, well, I've already talked about him. But I want to talk about another individual who was very emotional, very stressed, handled the presidency in a very bad way. Basically because of what was going on. And that was Warren G. Harding. You know, Warren G. Harding is a footnote in the history of the American presidency. We barely talk about him, and when we do talk about him, it isn't good. All we ever hear about is Teapot Dome, corruption, Nan Britton, and that he died in office, that he was inept. I don't think he was inept. I would be willing to say he's probably the nicest guy we ever had as president. I think he was too nice to be president. He used to joke, and he said if I was a woman, I'd always be in a family way. He said I can't say no. And Warren G. Harding looked like a president. He never should have been president. Newspaper editor. Married to a shrew of a woman. Also, the other thing is that Warren G. Harding, people talk about his speeches. I don't think they were that bad. I think some of them are really beautiful. And it's interesting to note that how many people have borrowed from Warren G. Harding and the things that he has said. And when he became president, he put together a cabinet that was truly incredible. First, a worldwide arms reduction treaty was done during his presidency. He also worked on trying to lower taxes, and the boom that was the Roaring Twenties is in many respects due to the beginnings of the work of Warren G. Harding's administration. He put William Howard Taft into the Supreme Court as the Chief Justice. He created the Veterans Administration. He did an awful lot. But the problem was he had some bad apples within his administration. And it got to Harding. Here was the nice guy who didn't like to say no. Here was the guy who liked to help people a lot. And here he was, surrounded by graft and corruption by the people he had appointed. And it got so bad that when he took his last trip, he was an emotional wreck. People would find him just sitting there crying. And they said, what's wrong? And he said, I can handle my enemies. He said, but it's my goddamn friends. They're the ones that are keeping me up and walking at night. The people he trusted basically deceived him. And what was worse, what was done to Harding while alive was just the precursor of what these same people would do to Harding when he was dead. He couldn't defend himself. So they blamed him for everything. Perfect fall guy. Yeah, I feel sorry for Warren G. Harding. I really think that he was truly one of our nicest guys who were president. But probably far better an individual to go have a drink with at a bar and talk than have him run the presidency of the United States. We've had far worse than Warren G. Harding, believe me. The only reason that Harding is so low on many polls is because they said the corruption, that he had mistresses. I don't think he was a dishonest individual, but I think people around him were. And if we could take many people within the presidency and not have any defenders for them, how well would they fare? Got to think about that. You know, other people in the presidency handled things pretty well. You know, Herbert Hoover was an unfortunate president. Franklin D. Roosevelt was amazingly well equipped to handle the Depression, which, to be perfectly honest, much of the New Deal wasn't cured by the various programs. It was cured by World War II. Harry S. Truman wasn't bothered at all by it. But let's talk about John F. Kennedy. Now, John F. Kennedy's another unfortunate. I think another kind of nice guy in many respects. He went through an awful lot. You have to remember in the closing speech of the Eisenhower administration, he said, beware of the military-industrial complex. John F. Kennedy was an individual who had gone through pain his whole life. He had survived just about everything. He was near death like 3 or 4 times before his assassination. Death was a constant companion with him, actually. He was quite comfortable with it. He was used to it. And he knew he wasn't going to live long. In fact, he kept in his notes, he thought he was going to be dead by 45. Made it to 46. He had the guts, think about this, to go against the military-industrial complex, to go against every various, the CIA. He fired the head of it and his assistant. He said, I'm going to chop it into 1,000,000 pieces, because he felt that the CIA was really bad. The Bay of Pigs situation, which was probably one of the biggest slaps in the face of John F. Kennedy. He was new. This was set up by Richard Nixon, mainly, in the Eisenhower administration. And they said, it's easy, it's all set, won't be a problem. Now, Kennedy was a neophyte. He had no idea what he was doing. And he agreed to it. And it was a disaster. It was an embarrassment. To his credit, he went and gave a news conference shortly afterwards. He said that success has 100 fathers, but failure is an orphan. Quite a statement. People said they would look at him and he would just be in rooms crying. He was devastated by it all. Well, then we went through the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's a lot more to that than what we let on. Kennedy was afraid that there was going to be a coup. He was afraid the military would take over. In fact, Robert Kennedy went to the Soviet ambassador and basically said that we don't know how long we're going to stay in charge. Emotionally, Kennedy was stressed to the max of breaking. It's incredible he didn't. Now, he was on a lot of drugs. He was on antidepressants. He was on stimulants. He was on cortisone. He was on steroids. He had testosterone. Made him a raging bull. But a man of amazing intellect, wit, emotion, and pain. Maybe, we don't know all of it yet, but as time goes by, we're going to learn a lot more about what went on in the Kennedy administration. Because emotionally, it was pretty hard. And what's incredible is that through all of that, very much like John Adams, he was being attacked at every angle. And he had enemies in every department of the government. It's amazing he didn't snap. Now, followed by Johnson. Johnson was pretty clinically depressed. I mean, the Vietnam War just finished him off. Ate him alive. He didn't want to look like he was weak. So he got involved in Vietnam. Kennedy was talking about getting us out of it. Cannot say. Who knows? Many people argue that fact, but I'm not going to state that. Richard Nixon. My God. Talk about another case of emotional problems. I've talked about him before, but think about this, Think about Richard Nixon in the sense that, as Mike Wallace mentioned to me, he said, greatest intellect I've ever seen, but a personality that was imperfect, was marred. I will tell you, Richard Nixon, of course, did, in a sense, break down toward the end. but he had everything going on around him too. And he did an awful lot of great stuff. He had a lot of enemies. Enemies, and, well, the old saying, politics makes strange bedfellows. And, well, Nixon was gone. Nixon lived long enough to redeem himself to a degree. Followed by Ford, Carter, whose presidency was somewhat of a disaster in many respects. He's still alive, still with us. He's a far better ex-president than he was president. It was a very bad time, and I'm sure he had his moments too. Reagan, it's hard to know with Reagan. Also, the others is followed by the Bushes. I remember what Mike Wallace said about George W. Bush after 9/11. Now, he would never say this on television, and this was a private comment, but I think it interesting to see his point of view. He said to me, after 9/11, George Bush had the entire world in his hands, and he fucked it up. That's a direct quote. He didn't offer to me an alternative, but that's what he said. He was not a fan of George W. Bush. And then, of course, now we have Obama, who seems to be pretty level. But we have had some people that have been pushed to the very breaking point. And none truly snapped. Nixon came close. Woodrow Wilson did. A few others went off the deep end. James Buchanan just drank constantly, smoked cigars, waited for his presidency to end. The country was near ending as well. So, I think that's enough. I've babbled enough at you. And, well, I hope you find this interesting. I like to just sit and chat about this. If you have comments, please leave them. You have questions, please. I hope someday to get like a group of people together and maybe sit around a table and talk. It'd be kind of fun to share that kind of stuff. So thank you.